Special thanks to Cars of Somerset for providing the vehicle in this review, and if you want to check out this car, if it is still currently for sale, or if you want to check out their other inventory, or even commission them to find you something across the UK, then click the link right below this video in the description, and you can find out everything they've currently got. When it comes to reviewing something like a BMW M3 of pretty much any generation, the risk is high of going against the grain if you don't like a car like this. It's such a thoroughly praised car that any petrolhead is at least aware of, if not a fan of, that even if somebody hasn't even driven one or even sat in one, they'll probably dislike anyone who says anything to the contrary about a car like it. It's kind of like a Supra or a Honda Type R or any other number of cars that has a ton of really fervent fans, like the M3 does. With that being said though, considering that everyone from your local car enthusiast all the way up to Top Gear has pretty thoroughly praised this car, what more is there really to say? Does it really need a review, or is it one of those cars where you can just go into it expecting the best and it 100% delivers because of its reputation? Surely it has that reputation for a reason. Well, that's what I wanted to find out when driving one, because this, along with a few other reviews that I've done, have really stood out to me in terms of being the never meet your heroes kind of mentality. Do they actually live up to their reputations? A prime example being, of course, the Ferrari F355, which I reviewed. So in this video, I'm going to get into, of course, a couple of things which I loved the most about the car, and maybe one or two things which I didn't dislike per se, but they just weren't as good as the other things. Now, in terms of what this car offers and does really well, you'd expect the number one thing for pretty much any reviewer to probably be how it feels through the twisty stuff. It is, at the end of the day, designed to be a driver's car. That's what BMW M cars are pretty much all about. It's certainly what they started off as, and the M3 is arguably the flagship of that. Now, in more recent years, it's kind of faded into the fray a little bit as stuff like M5s, M6s, M8s have all risen as well, but for a while, a good long while, the M3 was the benchmark, going up against stuff like the Mercedes C63, which I also reviewed here on the channel in a couple of different forms and really loved, and the Audi RS4 as well. But, perhaps surprisingly, the number one thing that I liked about this car was actually not the handling. We'll get to that in a second, but the thing which I enjoyed the most about it was actually the engine. I think this has a fantastic engine. It's a 4-litre naturally aspirated V8, which is relatively unique in spec compared to many of its rivals, nowhere near the size of an AMG of the time, a little bit smaller even than the Audi RS4, but sharing that naturally aspirated, higher revving style to the more muscle car approach of Mercedes. Now, the horsepower and torque figures vary quite a lot because it has a whole lot of power, in fact borderline Jag XKR levels at 414, but the torque is no way near that. For a 4-litre V8 that could sound surprising, but the fact that it's naturally aspirated adds to that, and also more importantly, BMW, interestingly, took a very Maserati approach to a performance V8. This is not like the thumpy Mercedes torquey V8, as I said, more of a muscle approach. This is almost a race engine approach. Yes, it's a relatively large capacity for a car of its type. Being a 4-litre is not a small engine, but it's all higher rev stuff. In fact, peak power, as I said, 414, only comes in at over 8,000 RPM, and peak torque is only 295 pound-feet, which is less than my Maserati has at about 340, and I don't even consider that to be a particularly torquey car. Now, peak torque, incidentally, is also at just under 4,000 RPM, so this is not a low-down car by any stretch. It's an engine which loves to be worked hard. Now that offers a potential downside in daily driving. If you plan to buy one of these and use it for fun, well of course the potential is there. If you plan to use it as a track day car, such as this one is, and I'm going to get into some of the mods that you can fairly apparently see that this one's had done to it, including stripping out the rear seats, the roll cage, the buckets, etc. But as I said, we'll get into that in a second. In terms of being a daily driver though, that's why sometimes I don't like high revving cars as much. Something like a Honda VTEC, or even typically speaking like a Maserati V8, isn't the kind of engine that I would typically like, because I like lazy engines, such as my former supercharged Jag, wherein it's all torque and barely ever gets above 4,000. This car isn't even getting started at 4,000 RPM. Now the great thing about that means that it sounds incredible. You could hear at the start it sounds fantastic, and in practice it sounds great as well. In fact, the sound surprised me by how much I liked it. I thought it was going to be a little bit more subtle, but it sounds fantastic. Not too high-pitched, so that it wouldn't be appropriate for the car, but also not as low and burbly as I thought it would be. Again, much more like a race engine. In terms of what that engine can do in practice when you fit it into this car, which incidentally was available in 3 different platforms, there's the E92, which is what most people tend to call this era overall, which is technically just the 2-door coupe, which is also the most common one. They built 40,000 of these. But there's also the E90, which is the 4-door version, the sedan. That is by far the rarest, with less than 10,000 built. And incidentally, that's my personal favourite version if I was going to buy one, for the practicality advantage. And then in between you have the convertible. Interestingly, no way near as many convertibles as coupes, about 16,000 compared to the 40,000. So the coupe and the convertible has a massive difference between the two, but at least in the UK you do see a healthy amount of convertibles for sale. The sedan, not so much. They are much, much rarer. Now in terms of values, at least here in the UK, you're starting at about 15 grand. Which isn't too bad for a car of its age. They started in 2007, ended in 2013. This particular car that I'm driving is a 2008, and at different points in that cycle, even within this generation, they did update it and add certain extra things. Now, for example, the initial cars back in 2007 only came as a 6-speed manual, and a lot of purists will probably want to go for that one. However, in 2008, pretty soon after that initial release, they did 2 major things. They introduced the DCT, a dual clutch transmission, which of course is a high-performance automatic in practice, and that was also when they introduced the sedan in that same year as well. Now, this car just goes to highlight yet again one of the many advantages I love about automatics over manuals, because of 2 things. One, the automatic has a whole extra gear over the manual, being a 7-speed to the 6, and crucially, it is quicker. The manual is officially rated at 4.8 seconds 0 to 60 to the 4.6 seconds of the dual clutch, and being a German car, doubtless both of those figures can be improved on, making the automatic clearly the faster option. Not necessarily the most fun option, depending on your driving style, but faster nonetheless. And incidentally, I really enjoyed using the DCT in this car. I used it briefly in paddle mode and also in full automatic, and it was a lot of fun. It felt like a really good gearbox, and it complemented that high revving V8 as well, even in kind of toddling around town kind of traffic. Not exactly what this particular spec of car was intended for, but it was capable of it nonetheless. Now that is actually another point which I want to get to, because some people would probably say, why did you choose to review this stripped, caged, lowered, crazy green track day M3? Surely you can't really get an accurate feel of what a normal M3 would be like. Well, in a very similar way to when I reviewed the amazing Golf R32 with around 350, I think it was, or 370 horsepower supercharged engine and a number of other mods, yes, you can make that argument, but the reason why I still chose to use those vehicles, in this case this stripped out M3 for a track day car, is because if you modify something, especially in a way which from a daily standpoint would technically make it worse, such as harsher track day suspension, a stripped out, potentially echoier, noisier interior, a restrictive roll cage and racing seat that doesn't allow you to move and certainly wouldn't match the comfort of a regular seat. Well, if the car still can feel good and enjoyable in those conditions, even on normal roads, well, to me that says a lot more about its capabilities. Much like with the Golf, it shows the potential that the platform has. Likewise with this one, I was actually surprised very pleasantly by how comfortable the ride still is with the KW coilovers that it's running. Yes, it's a track car, but it feels surprisingly great on the street as well. Now, in terms of issues that these cars can have, they do have a couple of more significant ones, which more owners will see and talk about, and those tend to be rod bearings and throttle body actuators. This car has both of those upgraded. ACL, ARP parts, etc. And you can find the full list of stuff that's been done to it on Jake's website, Cars of Somerset, down in the description, as I said at the start of the video. In terms of other stuff that he's done, of course, the AP Pro brakes, it's got BTCC touring car spec discs on it, a number of crazy over-the-top things which you wouldn't usually do to a street car, but, as I said, it takes it in its stride, and it shows that much like a lot of Japanese performance stuff, it is more than adept at coping with those kind of modifications without losing its essential underlying character, and more crucially from a used buying point of view, its daily usability. Now, if you do intend to buy one of these as something like a track day car, the number one thing you'll want to do is drop the weight, because it is heavy. Or at least it's one of those cars that kind of feels a little bit heavier than it is. It's only up around 1,600 kilos and about 1,800 in the case of the convertible, which you probably wouldn't use as a track car anyway, but it is a car that feels a little bit heavier than that, and I would agree with that. It's not bad, but you'll want to drop the weight from a track day perspective. On the road, it doesn't make any difference at all. It feels fantastic through corners, the handling is a pleasure to work with, and the only thing which I would caution you on, if you plan to buy one and use one all the time, is pretty much identical to what I said about the Mercedes-AMG C63. And I don't recall whether or not I said this about the newer or the older one, but whichever one it was that they can be a little bit tail happy. Not necessarily sliding around all the time, but you can kind of feel that the car wants to break loose sometimes. And if you're pushing it hard in Britain, wherein a lot of our roads aren't that great, and they are tighter, and in winter they become deadly in some cases, you might want to bear that in mind. And that is a crucial place in which something like an Audi RS4 or an RS5 will have a huge advantage. Sheer grip. And that's not really something you can argue with. Sure, you can drive one of these and not crash it, but having all-wheel drive is just easier, put simple. In terms of driving appeal, many petrol heads, many aficionados of purer driving, quote-unquote, will often choose rear-wheel drive, but that's down to you. Now, I covered, of course, the two more primary issues that these can have when it comes to the engine in particular. A couple of smaller things tends to be the oil consumption and oil leaks. On older cars with higher miles, that's something that you're going to want to look out for, and it's something that's relatively well known about older BMW engines in particular. In terms of the overall value for money that this one offers, especially when it comes to potentially using one as a daily, such as you can with a lot of the cars that I talk about, you could definitely daily drive a Jag XKR, I have. You could daily drive a Quattroporte or a Gran Turismo, again, I do. You can daily drive many of the vehicles that I've talked about, even some of the more expensive ones like your GTRs and Giulia Quadrifolios. This one has that potential. Absolutely, you could use this as a daily. The only caution I would give is that in exactly the same way as the Civic Type R which I reviewed, and another Honda Type R which is coming to the channel in a couple of days' time, it is such a high revving, playful engine which does all of its best work, not even most of it, all of its best work, at least at 4,000 RPM, all the way up to over 8, much like a race engine. Well, it just means that in normal driving conditions, you are simply not going to get the most out of it. Not just for performance, but even just for fun. Now, if that's fine with you, absolutely go for it. It still felt great at normal speeds, and apart from the fact that of course it was a little bit harsher and hotter and rattlier and noisier because of its track day spec, it still goes to show how much more smooth, more comfortable and more refined a completely stock one would feel. To me, this car has a ton of potential. Is it a car that I would personally buy, given the praise that I'm showering it with? To be honest, no. And the reason why is twofold. In fact, technically three. One is the fact that you do have to work the engine very hard, and that's simply not my style of vehicle, which sounds a bit counterintuitive given that I drive a Ferrari-engined Maserati, which again is a very high revving motor which does most of its work at higher RPMs, but the funny thing about that engine is it doesn't feel like that. It actually feels much more adept at cruising speeds than this one or a Type R engine does. The two more interesting things to me though, which would probably put me off, would be the fact that, one, you see quite a few M3s around, and I like to be a little bit more oddball and a little bit different. XKRs, Maseratis, you know, something a little bit more rare and a bit more of a risk, you could say in some cases. And secondly, I'm personally just not a huge fan of these interiors. Newer ones, you know, newer Beamer interiors, newer German interiors, yeah, they're great. But there was a period around 2005 to 2010 where I just wasn't really a huge fan. To me, they're a little bit forgettable when it comes to the interior design. That, again, is purely down to personal preference. I know a lot of people won't care in the slightest about that, but as a reviewer, it is one of those things that stood out to me. Overall, when it comes to actual driving, handling, performance, the sound, the experience, yeah, it definitely does deliver. I can see why it has the hype, and even though I wouldn't call it my favourite thing ever, there is certainly a lot to love. I could easily see how M3s could become your thing, how you just don't really need anything else. And if you buy the 4-door version, well, even more so. I kind of wish there was even a wagon. That would be pretty badass. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the E92 M3. Tell me your thoughts down below if you just like these, if you were an owner, if you still are, maybe some warnings for potential owners, things they need to look out for. Slap those down below in the comments for other people to benefit from, and of course, if you are new to Beards and Cars, then click the playlist showing on the screen right now to check out the other reviews which I talked about. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.